sources that are popping up, including Newsmax, will continue to follow truth wherever it may lead. We're not supposed to have the news and the media be biased. Go follow the facts.
Congressman, don't you get the sense, though, that when it comes to like the origins of the coronavirus or what's happening on the border, sooner or later the truth actually does get out?
I think so. I mean, but it takes the relentless pursuit of it by some of us, whether we're elected officials and we try to dig into it and to get that information out to the media, or whether it's the media digging, and then we learn from it, on our side in elected office. And so, I think we should continue to do that. But I'm reminded in 2007 or so, when we had the first big fight over amnesty and border security, and I was a staffer on the Senate Judiciary Committee, I was having to dig into a 1,000-page bill, find all the nuances that were problematic, which really were basically expanding amnesty, while a lot of Republicans were trying to sell to the American people, no, this isn't amnesty, it's a great security bill. And you'd go find the actual language. And we didn't have Twitter. We didn't have the ability to circulate it easily. I was basically emailing that stuff to some friends at, I won't say who, but a couple different blogs out there, and then we're getting it out to the world. We have to work at it constantly, seek the truth, and go dive into it. And God bless any of the intrepid reporters who are diving into this stuff.
Well, Congressman Roy, we appreciate you being our leadoff hitter. Thank you so much for joining us this morning on Save the Nation.
Except there's really no mystery. Oil is measured in dollars, which is the untold story of an oil price that is 7 times what it was in 1998. To understand today's price, you have to understand the direction of the dollar over the last 21 years. Better yet, oil's latest lurch past $70 will ideally wake up economists, politicians, and the pundit class to the basics of money. Now, to understand money better, it's worth it for viewers to think about their height if suddenly the inch were cut in half. If so, those of us who are 6 feet tall would soon measure 12 feet. Yet as viewers can surely deduce, our height wouldn't change one iota. It would only change in terms of the measure, like the inch and foot. Money is no different. The reality is that changes in the price of money don't in any way alter the real prices of actual market goods. In truth, changes made to the measure that is money only alter the money prices of goods. If a currency's value is shrunken, the currency will exchange for fewer and fewer market goods. To be clear, shrinking the currency is inflation. That's why the policy choice that is devaluation is so harmful to workers of all stripes. Suddenly, the money they earn and have earned doesn't exchange for as many goods and services as it used to. Also, it cannot be forgotten that investment drives economic growth. When investors put money to work, they're buying future returns in money. Devaluation is a tax on investment. Oil didn't spike in the 2000s because of sunspots or demand from India and China. Instead, it spiked because the measure in which it's priced in world markets plummeted. Realistically, the silliest argument made about oil to this day is that economic growth boosts its price. What a laugh. Oil was once again cheap in the booming 80s and 90s, but it was at nosebleed levels in the malaise-ridden 1970s, and it similarly traded at many multiples of 80s to 90s prices in the economic crisis-laden 21st century. Shrink the measure that is money, and you'll get rising prices. Now, with us here to discuss this is regular Save the Nation guest Steve Forbes, who knows this subject better than most. Steve, thank you so much for joining us.
Good to be with you. Thank you.
Now, Steve, I say the best way to vivify what's happening with oil today is to travel back in time to the 1970s. To this day, history books claim that there were oil shocks back then, except that there weren't. Please explain.
Well, there were shocks in the nominal price, but when they devalued the dollar after taking it off the gold standard, suddenly dollar prices of things like oil went up, not the real value. If you measured oil against gold, you didn't see much of an increase at all. And so what happens, though, prices are how an economy works. It gives us, you might say, priceless information for buyers and sellers and producers. So when you do that, when you devalue the dollar or cheapen the dollar, it's like putting a virus in the computer, corrupts the information. So the nominal price of oil went up, and normal people said, gosh, there must be a shortage. OPEC must be up to no good. And bad things are happening. We got to produce more oil. And the bad thing about it, it not just leads to higher nominal prices when people have a lower standard of living, but also misallocates savings and capital. People thought, well, high price, Must mean a shortage. So a lot of money poured into what they call the oil patch. And it all came crashing down in the 1980s. We saw the same thing repeat with housing in the early 2000s when the dollar was debased. Housing prices went up. People thought, oh, we must have a shortage of houses. And so we saw what that led to. So it's really damaging. It hurts the social fabric, misallocates people's money, and ends up having people have a lower standard of living and absolutely confused as to why it happened. And that's how you get scapegoating bad political results.
Debased money creates so much misinformation, and it is now. Your explanation in many ways makes it easy to connect the dots in terms of what happened after the 1970s. In the 80s and 90s, the price of oil, as we know, plummeted. What happened? Was OPEC feeling generous, or was it something dollar related?
Well, you had stories throughout the 80s and 90s about OPEC meeting and trying to cut back. And of course, they all cheated. Those cartels never really work in the real world because everyone's trying to get an advantage. And so, no, oil crashed down to from $40 a barrel down to 10. That was from a real deflation that we had in the early 80s. And then it finally settled in the 90s around $20, $25 a barrel. And then suddenly in the early 2000s, it soared up again. And why did that happen? No, it was not sunspots, moon spots, green cheese, or anything else. It was the dollar being devalued. You saw gold more than double in price. And so guess what? Oil prices went up, peaked for a brief time in 2008 at $140 a barrel, then crashed again. And so it had nothing to do with traditional supply and demand, productivity, or anything else, but it led to massive confusion and a lot of turmoil, unnecessary turmoil. And we're still paying the real price for it today.
Yeah, this is so important to think about. Oil did not become scarce in the 21st century. What happened is that we devalued the dollar. We've seen this movie before in the 70s. We saw it. We've seen it again in the 21st century. Steve, thank you so much for being here and coming on to discuss this.
Kind of like a terrorist act in a way. And so it's very alarming to the whole international community, especially the Western world, that this happened, because the flight was not even supposed to land in Belarus. It was only flying in Belarusian airspace. And so it's very concerning that we're seeing this. And it's very good that the Western world was taking action.
So could you explain what's the relationship between Belarus and Russia? You mentioned how you've had Europe's last dictator in Belarus, but it seems like there's quite a strong relationship between Putin and Belarus.
Yeah, so starting in the 1990s, Belarus and Russia formed a union state agreement, which essentially meant that they would integrate their economies, they would create one flag, all of that. So this framework agreement is already signed, but the union state has not been formally integrated. And so Belarus and Russia right now are still separate nations. But as of late, Belarus and Russia have been getting even closer. Putin and Lukashenko met just the other week. They're pretty buddy-buddy. Lukashenko tries to kind of gain Putin's favor. And so it looks like potentially soon Russia and Belarus could form a formal union state. And this would be terrible for the United States and the Western world because it would have serious security implications.
Because you would end up putting Russia right on the border with Poland and right on the border of Europe again.
Exactly. It would border a few more NATO nations, and so it would greatly affect European security. So
I want to talk a little bit. Vladimir Putin's going to be sitting down with Joe Biden pretty soon here. It's been kind of fishy with U.S. policies. I don't understand what the Biden administration's goal towards Russia. I was shocked that they basically just greenlit the Nord Stream pipeline, which is a huge gift to Putin. Yet Putin has just come out and said that he basically is hinting that he's got some moves to stir up some tension before that meeting. Do you have any insight for us?
Yeah, so the summit's going to be June 16th in Geneva, Switzerland, so completely on neutral ground, which is good for a summit, of course. But it's extremely concerning that President Putin in Russia is saying that the U.S. should be watching out at this summit. I'm not sure he could say that Russia is going to close down the American embassy in Moscow. Already, the Russian Foreign Ministry advised our ambassador there to come back to the U.S. to talk with Biden administration officials and seek a better understanding of how the U.S. should deal with Russia. And already the US is not allowing Russian citizens on a tourist visa even to visit the US. So relations are really tight right now. They're really tense. And so President Biden should go into the summit with a clear head and not trust Vladimir Putin.
This is starting to sound a lot like the good old Cold War days. All of a sudden, secret, or not secret, but meetings and rendezvous in third countries is kind of amazing. Just a few seconds left. Is there any way that with Russia and China getting closer, is there any way the United States could potentially even use this as an opportunity to get close to Russia, or with Putin in power, is that just impossible?
I think even with China being a threat, I think President Biden needs to not have a super close relationship with Putin. Of course, keep dialogue going, but President Biden needs to know that he can't trust Putin, and we can't have another Obama-era Russian reset because that failed miserably. And so we need to make sure that we are standing strong and not giving in to what Russia wants.
Brandon, the world experienced nothing short of a miracle this past week when Western media outlets collectively performed a genuine mea culpa and admitted that they had gotten one of the biggest stories in modern history completely wrong. Of course, you probably guess I'm speaking of the 180-degree flip our media did on the explosive story that COVID-19 may have, in fact, been leaked from a lab in Wuhan, China, a lab known to be conducting controversial gain-of-function and spillover potential research on, wait for it, coronaviruses. This is evidenced by the fact that staff from the Wuhan lab were hospitalized a month before the COVID outbreak was even disclosed by China with COVID-like symptoms. And the media, after a year of refusing to do their jobs, the press was forced to admit that Trump was most likely right, and that by denouncing President Trump's claims as a debunked conspiracy theory, they were wrong. Not just wrong, but dead wrong. And even more, by suppressing the lab leak story, they might also be culpable in accelerating the spread and deadliness of the pandemic, since virologists and epidemiologists spent more than a year on a wild goose chase looking for a natural source of the pathogen when we could have tracked down the actual lab-grown source and known to tailor our medicine accordingly sooner. A press correspondent for ABC News admitted the source behind their mistake on the air.
And yes, I think a lot of people have egg on their face. This was an idea that was first put forward by Mike Pompeo, Secretary of State, Donald Trump. And look, some things may be true even if Donald Trump said them. And
so Trump derangement syndrome, which the press has dismissed as debunked fake news, turns out to have been true. If Trump said it, the knee-jerk reaction is it must immediately and summarily be rejected. The truth be damned. In the left's lockstep mission to defeat Trump and the Republicans at all costs, it was more important than the truth that ended up being sacrificed, as families who lost loved ones to COVID-19 will certainly attest. At such moments, the natural human response we might hope to see would be at least a little bit of self-reflection. Maybe those in the press might ask themselves, how sure are we about this story before they go ahead and hit the publish button? One thing that Americans both on the right and the left can agree on is that during the Trump era, the media gave up on all pretenses of being objective. And as consumers of journalism, what lessons are we to learn from the Wuhan lab episode? Well, given the gravity of how wrong they were, and given how sure they were not wrong, it should be natural, at the very least, that we should be skeptical, especially when the press simply parrot each other and cite each other as sources. Essentially, the media has shown that just because they are sure of themselves does not mean they are trusted to tell the truth.